the universities, which in some places keeps the university open, the doors open. It's big money. It's just big money. And I think it's unfortunate, but that's another side of it, that the universities depend on that kind of income in order to keep going.
Yeah.
That was a deliberate choice. And
I know.
I think it's also part
I
of
know.
the ongoing destruction of the idea of a university.
I agree.
as a-
agree.
And there's also a certain elitism, I think. You know, if you wanted to attend Notre Dame University, it would cost you $55,000 a year in fees.
Just
Right.
Yeah, I know.
That's not easy to make up.
No.
No,
However-
it's not. Anyway,
Well, let's
we
do our
are
best.
we are on YouTube Live. So I will tell those who might watch this sometime in the future that we're continuing our reading of Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. We're beginning chapter 5. And so if you're watching this later and you want to read along with the video, just go to chapter 5, which begins with, here we go. He drained his third cup of watery tea to the dregs and set to chewing the crust of fried bread that were scattered near him, staring into the dark pool of the jar. The yellow dripping had been scooped out like a bog hole, and the pool under it brought back to his memory the dark turf-colored water of the bath in Clongowes. The box of pawn tickets at his elbow had just been rifled, and he took up idly one after another in his greasy fingers the blue and white dockets, scrawled and sanded and creased, and bearing the name of the pledger as Daly or McAvoy. 1 pair buskins, 1 D coat, 3 articles and white, 1 man's pants. Then he put them aside and gazed thoughtfully at the lid of the box, speckled with louse marks, and asked vaguely, "How much is the clock fast now?" Please.
His mother straightened the battered alarm clock that was lying on its side in the middle of the kitchen mantelpiece until its dial showed 11:45, and then laid it once more on its side. 1 hour and 25 minutes, she said. The right time now is 10:20. The dear knows you might try to be in time for your lectures. Fill out the place for me to wash, said Stephen. Katie, fill out the place for Stephen to wash. Booty, fill out the place for Stephen to wash. I can't, I'm going for blue. Fill it out you, Maggie. When the enameled basin had been fitted into the well of the sink and the old washing glove flung on the side of it, he allowed his mother to scrub his neck and root into the folds of his ears and into the interstices at the wing of his nose. Well, it's a poor case, she said, when a university student is so dirty that his mother has to wash him. But it gives you pleasure, said Stephen calmly. An ear-splitting whistle was heard from upstairs, and his mother thrust a damp overall into his hand, saying, "Dry yourself and hurry out for the love of goodness." A second shrill whistle, prolonged angrily, brought one of the girls to the foot of the staircase. "Yes, father." "Is your lazy bitch of a brother gone out yet?" "Yes, father." "Sure?" "Yes, father." The girl came back, making signs to him to be quick and go out quietly by the back. Stephen laughed and said, "He has a curious idea of genders if he thinks the bitch is masculine." "It's a scandalous shame for you, Stephen," said his mother, "and you'll live to rue the day you set your foot in that place. I know how it has changed you." "Good morning, everybody," said Stephen, smiling and kissing the tips of his fingers in adieu. The lane behind the terrace was waterlogged, and as he went down it slowly, choosing his steps amid heaps of wet rubbish, he heard a mad nun screeching in the nuns' madhouse beyond the wall. "Jesus, oh Jesus, Jesus." Next, please.
He shook the sound out of his ears by an angry toss of his head and hurried on, stumbling through the mouldering offal, his heart already bitten by an ache of loathing and bitterness. His father's whistle, his mother's mutterings, the screech of an unseen maniac were to him now so many offending voices and threatening to humble the pride of his youth. He drove their echoes even out of his heart with an execration. But as he walked down the avenue and felt the grey morning light falling about him through the dripping trees and smelled the strange wild smell of the wet leaves and bark, his soul was loosed of her miseries. The rain-laden trees of the avenue evoked in him, as always, memories of the girls and women in the plays of Gerhard Hauptmann, and the memory of their pale sorrows and the fragrance falling from the wet branches mingled in a mood of quiet joy. His morning walk across the city had begun, and he foreknew that as he passed the sloblands of Fairview, he would think of the cloistral silver-veined prose of Newman, that as he walked along the North Strand Road, glancing idly at the windows of the provisions shops, he would recall the dark humor of Guido Cavalcanti and smile, that as he went by Baird's stone-cutting works in Talbot Place, the spirit of Ibsen would blow through him like a keen wind, a spirit of wayward, boyish beauty, and that passing a grimy marine dealer's shop beyond the Liffey, he would repeat the song by Ben Jonson, which begins, excuse me, I was not wearier where I lay.
His mind, when wearied of its search for the essence of beauty amid the spectral words of Aristotle or Aquinas, turned often for its pleasure to the dainty songs of the Elizabethans. His mind, in the vesture of a doubting monk, stood often in shadow under the windows of that age, to hear the grave and mocking music of the lutenists or the frank laughter of waistcoaters, until a laugh too low, a phrase tarnished by time of chambering and false honor, stung his monkish pride and drove him on from his lurking place. The lore which he was believed to pass his days brooding upon, so that it had wrapped him from the companionships of youth, was only a garner of slender sentences from Aristotle's Poetics and Psychology, and a synopsis philosophae scholasticae ad mentem divi tome. His thinking was a dusk of doubt and self-mistrust, lit up at moments by the lightnings of intuition, but lightnings of so clear a splendor that in those moments the world perished about his feet, as if it had been fire consumed, and thereafter his tongue grew heavy, and he met the eyes of others with unanswering eyes, for he felt that the spirit of beauty had folded him round like a mantle, and that in reverie, at least, he had been acquainted with nobility. But when this brief pride of silence upheld him no longer, he was glad to find himself still in the midst of common lives, passing on his way amid the squalor and noise and sloth of the city fearlessly and with a light heart. Next.
Near the hoardings on the canal, he met the consumptive man with the doll's face and the brimless hat, coming towards him down the slope of the bridge with little steps, tightly buttoned into his chocolate overcoat, and holding his furled umbrella a span or two from him, like a divining rod. It must be 11, he thought, and peered into a dairy to see the time. The clock in the dairy told him that it was 5 minutes to 5, but as he turned away, he heard a clock somewhere near him, but unseen, beating 11 strokes in swift precision. He laughed as he heard it, for it made him think of McCann. and he saw him, a squat figure in a shooting jacket and breeches and with a fair goatee, standing in the wind at Hopkins Corner, and heard him say, "Daedalus, you're an antisocial being, wrapped up in yourself. I'm not. I'm a Democrat, and I'll work and act for social liberty and equality among all classes and sexes in the United States of the Europe of the future." 11. Then he was late for that lecture too. What day of the week was it? He stopped at a newsagent's to read the headline of a placard. Thursday, 10 to 11. English, 11 to 12. French, 12 to 1. Physics. He fancied to himself the English lecturer and felt, even at that distance, restless and helpless. He saw the heads of his classmates legally bent as they wrote in their notebooks the points they were bidden to note, nominal definitions, essential definitions, and examples or dates of birth or death. Chief works are a favorable and an unfavorable criticism, side by side. Next, please.
His own head was bent, for his thoughts wandered abroad, and whether he looked around at the little class of students or out of the window across the desolate gardens of the green, an odor assailed him of cheerless cellar damp and decay. Another head than his, right before him in the first benches, was poised squarely above its bending fellows, like the head of a priest appealing without humility to the tabernacle for the humble worshipers about him. Why was it that when he thought of Cranley, he could never raise before his mind the entire image of his body, but only the image of the head and face? Even now, against the gray curtain of the morning, he saw it before him like a phantom of a dream, the face of a severed head or death mask, crowned on the brows by its stiff black upright hair as by an iron crown. It was a priest-like face, priest-like in its pallor, in the wide-winged nose, in the shadowings below the eyes and along the jaws, priest-like in the lips that were long and bloodless and faintly smiling. And Stephen, remembering swiftly how he had told Cranley of all the tumults and unrest and longings in his soul, day after day and night by night, only to be answered by his friend's listening silence, would have told himself that it was the face of a guilty priest who heard confessions of those whom he had not power to absolve, but that he felt again in memory the gaze of its dark, womanish eyes. Next, please.
Through the image, he had a glimpse of a strange, dark cavern of speculation, but at once turned away from it, feeling that it was not yet the hour to enter in. But the nightshade of his friend's listlessness seemed to be diffusing in the air around him, a tenuous and deadly exhalation, and he found himself glancing from one casual word to another on his right or left, in stolid wonder that they had been so silently emptied of instantaneous sense until every mean shop legend bound his mind like the word of a spell, and his soul shriveled up, sighing with age as he walked on in a lane among heaps of dead language. His own consciousness of language was ebbing from him, from his brain, and trickling into the very words themselves, which set the hand and disband themselves in wayward rhythms. The ivy winds upon the wall, and winds and twines upon the wall. The yellow ivy upon the wall, ivy, ivy up the wall. Did anyone ever hear such a drivel? Lord Almighty, who ever heard of ivy winding up on a wall? Yellow ivy, that was all right. Yellow ivory also. And what about ivory ivy? The word now shone in his brain, clearer and brighter than any ivory sewn from the mottled tusks of elephants. Ivory, ivior, avior, ebor. One of the first examples that he had learnt in Latin had run India mitter ebor, and he recalled the shrewd northern face of the rector who had taught him to construe the Metamorphoses of Ovid in a courtly English, made whimsical by the mention of porkers and potsherds and chines of bacon. He had learned what little he knew of the laws of Latin verse from a ragged book written by a Portuguese priest. Contrabit orator variant in Camryn Bates. Next, please. Sue John.
Is that me? Because I can't find a list here. The crisis and victories and successions in Roman history were handed on to him in the trite words in tanto discrimine, and he had tried to peer into the social life of the city of cities through the words implere olim denariorium, which the rector had sonorously as the filling of a pot with denaries. The pages of his time-worn Horace never felt cold to the touch, even when his own fingers were cold. They were human pages, and 50 years before they had been turned by human fingers, of John Duncan Invariarty and by his brother William Malcolm Invariarty. Yes, those were noble names on the dusty flyleaf, and even for so poor a Latinist as he, the dusky verses were as fragrant as though they had lain all those years in myrtle and lavender and vervain. But yet it wounded him to think that he would never be but a shy guest at the feast of the world's culture, and that the monkish learning, in terms of which he was striving to forge out an aesthetic philosophy, was held no higher by the age he lived in than the subtle and curious jargons of heraldry and falconry. Next, please.
The gray block of Trinity on his left sat heavily in the city's ignorance like a dull stone, sat in a cumbrous ring, pulled his mind downward. And while he was striving this way and that to free his feet from the fetters of the reformed conscience, he came upon the droll statue of the national poet of Ireland. He looked at it without anger. For though sloth of the body and of the soul crept over it like unseen vermin, over the shuffling feet and up the folds of the cloak and around the servile head, it seemed humbly conscious of its indignity. It was a firbolg in the borrowed cloak of a Milesian, and he thought of his friend Davin, the peasant student. It was a jesting name between them, but the young peasant bore with it lightly. Go on, Stevie. I have a hard head, you tell me. Call me what you will. The homely version of his Christian name on the lips of his friend had touched Stephen pleasantly, and first heard, for he was as formal in speech with others as they were with him. Often as he sat in Davin's rooms in Grantham Street, wondering at his friend's well-made boots that flanked the wall pair by pair, and repeating for his friend's simple ear the verses and cadences of others, which were the veils of his own longing and dejection. The crude Filborg mind of his listener had drawn his mind towards it and flung it back again, drawing it by a quiet inbred courtesy of attention, or by a quaint turn of old English speech, or by the force of its delight in rude bodily skill. For Davin had sat at the feet of Michael Cusack, the Gael, repelling swiftly and suddenly by the grossness of intelligence, or by the bluntness of feeling, or by the dull stare of terror in the eye, the terror of a soul of a starving Irish village in which the curfew was still a nightly fear. Next, please.
Side by side with his memory of the deeds of prowess of his uncle Matt Davin, the athlete, the young peasant worshipped the sorrowful legend of Ireland, the gossip of his fellow students, which strove to render the flat life of the college significant at any cost, loved to think of him as a young Fenian. His nurse had taught him Irish, and shaped his rude imagination by the broken lights of Irish myth. He stood towards this myth upon which no individual mind had ever drawn out a line of beauty, and to its unwieldy tales that divided themselves as they moved down the cycles in the same attitude as towards the Roman Catholic religion, the attitude of a dull-witted, loyal serf. Whatsoever of thought or of feeling came to him from England or by way of English culture. His mind stood armed against in obedience to a password. And of the world that lay beyond England, knew only the Foreign Legion of France, in which he spoke of serving. Coupling this ambition with the young man's humour, Stephen had often called him one of the tame geese. And there was even a point of irritation in the name, pointed against that very reluctance of speech and deed in his friend, which seems so often to stand between Stephen's mind, eager of speculation, and the hidden ways of Irish life. One night, the young peasant, his spirit stung by the violent or luxurious language in which Stephen escaped from the cold silence of intellectual revolt, had called up before Stephen's mind a strange vision. The two were walking slowly towards Davin's room through the dark, narrower streets of the poorer Jews. A thing happened to myself, Stevie, last autumn, coming on winter, and I never told it to a living soul, and you are the first person now I ever told it to. I disremember if it was October or November. It was October because it was before I came up here to join the matriculation class. Stephen had turned his smiling eyes towards his friend's face, flattered by his confidence and won over to sympathy by the speaker's simple accent. I was away all that day from my own place over in Buttevant. I don't know if you know where it is, at a hurling match between Croke's own boys and the fearless Thurles, and by God, Stevie, that was the hard fight. My first cousin, Fancy Davin, was stripped to his buff that day, minding cool for the Limericks. But he was up with the forwards half the time and shouting like mad. I will never forget that day. One of the Crokes made a woeful wipe at him one time with his come on, and I declare to God he was with an aim's ace of getting it at the side of his temple. Oh, honest to God, Stephen, if the crook of it caught him that time, he was done for. I'm glad he escaped, Stephen said with a laugh. But surely that's not the strange thing that happened to you. Next, please.
Well,
Sorry.
Okay, well, I suppose that doesn't interest you, but leastways there was such noise after the match that I missed the train home, and I couldn't get any kind of a yoke to give me a lift for, as luck would have it. There was a meeting that same day over in Castletown Rock, and all the cars in the country were there. So there was nothing for me for it only to stay the night or to foot it out. Well, I started to walk, and on I went, and it was coming on night when I got into the Ballyhora Hills. That's better than 10 miles from Kilmallock. And there's a long, lonely road after that. You wouldn't see the sign of a Christian house along the road or hear a sound. It was pitch dark almost. Once or twice I stopped by the way under a bush to redden my pipe, and only for the dew was thick, I'd have stretched out there and slept. At last, after a bend in the road, I spied a little cottage with a light in the window. I went up and I knocked at the door. A voice asked, who was there? And I answered I was over at the match in Boutvant and was walking back, and that I'd be thankful for a glass of water. After a while, a young woman opened the door and brought me out a big mug of milk. She was half undressed, as if she was going to bed when I knocked, and she had her hair hanging, and I thought by her figure and by something in the look of her eyes that she must be carrying a child. She kept me in talk a long while at the door, and I thought it strange because her breast and her shoulders were bare. She asked me, was I tired and would I like to stop the night there? She said she was all alone in the house and that her husband had gone that morning to Queenstown with his sister to see her off. And all the time she was talking, Stevie, she had her eyes fixed on my face, and she stood so close to me, I could hear her breathing. When I handed her back the mug at last, she took my hand to draw me in over the threshold and said, come in and stay the night here, You've no call to be frightened. There's no one in it but ourselves. I didn't go in, Stevie. I thanked her and went on my way again, all in a fever. At the first bend of the road, I looked back and she was standing in the door. The last words of Davin's story sang in his memory, and the figure of the woman in the story stood forth reflected in other figures of the peasant women whom he had seen standing in the doorways at Clare, at the college car, as the college cars drove by, as a type of her race and his own, a bat-like soul, waking to the consciousness of itself in darkness and secrecy and loneliness, and through the eyes and voice and gesture of a woman without guile, calling the stranger to her bed. Next.
Okay, so Joe will go, and then after Joe, it'll be Lois. And when you get a chance, please review the chat list. Okay, Joe.
I don't have the chat list. And
Um,
I don't
can you
seem
get-
to be able to get one.
are you on chat at all? Can you get chat? Because I put it up.
Well, yeah, I don't know what I had a hard time getting on today. I had a terrible time.
Okay,
Here,
so you will be
here.
going after Ann Doyle, Joan.
Yeah, okay.
And the
Did I-
chat list is really, it's Duncan, Donna, Joe, Ann Meisner, Lois, Katrina, Ann Doyle, and Joan. And then it's back to me. Okay? All right,
Okay.
Joe, take it away.
A hand was laid on his arm, and a young voice cried, "Ah, gentleman, your own girl, sir. The first hansel today, gentlemen. Buy that lovely bunch. Will you, gentlemen?" The blue flowers which she lifted towards him, and her young blue eyes seemed to him at that instant images of guilelessness. And he halted till the image had vanished, and he saw only her ragged dress and damp coarse hair and hoydenish face. "Do, gentlemen, don't forget your own girl, sir." "I have no money," said Stephen. "Buy them lovely ones, will you, sir? Only a penny." "Did you hear what I said?" asked Stephen, bending towards her. "I told you, I have no money. I tell you again now." "Well, sure, you will some day, sir, please God," the girl answered after an instant. "Possibly," said Stephen. "I don't think it's likely." He left her quickly, fearing that her intimacy might turn to jibing, and wishing to be out of the way before she offered her ware to another, a tourist from England or a student of Trinity. Grafton Street, along which he walked, prolonged the moment of discouraged poverty. In the roadway at the head of the street, a slab was set to the memory of Wolfe Tone, and he remembered having been present with his father at its laying. He remembered with bitterness that scene of tawdry tribute. There were 4 French delegates in a brake, and one, a plump, smiling young man, held wedged on a stick a card on which were printed the words "Vive l'Ireland." But the trees in Stephen's Green were fragrant of rain, and rain-sodden earth gave forth its mortal odor, a faint incense rising upward through the mold from many hearts, the soul of the gallant venal city which his elders had told him of had shrunk with time to a faint mortal odor rising from the earth, and he knew that in a moment when he had entered the sombre college, he would be conscious of a corruption other than that of Buckegan and Burnchapel Whaley. Next, please.
It was too late to go upstairs to the French class. He crossed the hall and took the corridor to the left. which led to the physics theater. The coroner revealed that it was not unnatural. Was it because he had heard that in Buck Whaley's time there was a secret staircase there? Or was the Jesuit house extraterritorial, and was he walking among aliens? The Ireland of Tone and of Parnell seemed to have receded in space. Next, please.
He opened the door of the theater and halted in the chilly gray light that struggled through the dusty windows. A figure was crouching before the large grate, and by its leanness and grayness, he knew that it was the Dean of Studies lighting the fire. Stephen closed the door quietly and approached the fireplace. "Good morning, sir. Can I help you?" The priest looked up quickly and said, "One moment now, Mr. Dedalus, and you will see there is an art in lighting a fire. We have the liberal arts and we have the useful arts. This is one of the useful arts." "I will try to learn it," said Stephen. "Not too much coal," said the dean, working briskly at his task. "That is one of the secrets." He produced 4 candle butts from the side pockets of his soutane and placed them deftly among the coals and twisted papers. Stephen watched him in silence. Kneeling thus on the flagstone to kindle the fire, and busied with the disposition of his wisps of paper and candle butts, he seemed more than ever a humble server making ready the place of sacrifice in an empty temple, a Levite of the Lord. Like a Levite's robe of plain linen, the faded worn soutane draped the kneeling figure of one whom the canonicals or the bell-bordered ephod would irk trouble. His very body had waxed in lowly service of the Lord, in tending the fire upon the altar, in bearing tidings secretly, in waiting upon worldlings, in striking swiftly when bidden, and yet had remained ungraced by aught of saintly or prelatic beauty. Nay, his very soul had waxed old in that service without growing towards the light and beauty or spreading abroad a sweet odor of her sanctity, a mortified will no more responsive to the thrill of its obedience than was to the thrill of love or combat, his aging body, spare and sinewy, grayed with a silver-pointed down. Next, please.
The dean rested back on his hunkers and watched the stinks catch. Stephen, to fill the silence, said, "I'm sure I could not light a fire." "You are an artist, are you not, Mr. Dedalus?" said the dean, glancing up and blinking his pale eyes. "The object of the artist is the creation of the beautiful. What the beautiful is another question." He rubbed his hands slowly and dryly over the difficulty. "Can you solve that question now?" he asked. "Aquinas," answered Stephen, says, "Pulchra sunt caecavis placent." "The fire before us," said the dean, "will be pleasing to the eye. Will it therefore be beautiful? Insofar as it is apprehended by the sight, which I suppose means here aesthetic intellectual. It will be beautiful. But Aquinas also says, bonum est quod tendit appetitus. Insofar as it satisfies the animal craving for warmth, fire it is a good. In hell, however, it is an evil." "Quite so," said the dean. "You have certainly hit the nail on the head." He rose nimbly and went towards the door, set it ajar, and said, "A draught is said to be a help in these matters." As he came back to the hearth, limping slightly, but with a brisk step, Stephen saw the silent soul of a Jesuit look out at him from the pale, loveless eyes. Like Ignatius, he was lame, but in his eyes burned no spark of Ignatius' enthusiasm. Even the legendary craft of the company, a craft subtler and more secret than its fabled books of secret subtle wisdom, had not fired his soul with the energy of apostleship. It seemed as if he used the ships and lore and cunning of the world as bidden to do, for the greater glory of God, without joy in their handling or hatred of that in them which was evil, but turning them with a firm gesture of obedience back upon themselves. And for all this silent service, it seemed as if he loved not at all the master, and little, if at all, the ends he served. Okay. simulate atque senus brachius. He was, as the founder would have him, had him, like a staff in an old man's hand, to be leaned on in the road at nightfall, or in stress of weather, to lie with a lady's nose grey on a garden seat, to be raised in menace. Next, please.
The dean returned to the hearth and began to stroke his chin. When may we expect to have something from you on the aesthetic question, he asked. From me? Said Stephen in astonishment. I stumble on an idea once a fortnight if I am lucky. These questions are very profound, Mr. Daedalus, said the dean. It is like looking down from the cliffs of Moher into the depths. Many go down into the depths and never come up. Only the trained diver can go down into those depths and explore them and come to the surface again. If you mean supplication, sir, said Stephen, I also am sure that there is no such thing as free thinking, inasmuch as all thinking must be bound by its own laws. Ha! For my purpose, I can work on at present by the light of one or two ideas of Aristotle and Aquinas. I see. I quite see your point. I need them only for my own use and guidance until I have done something for myself by their light. If the lamp smokes or smells, I shall try to trim it. If it does not give light enough, I shall sell it and buy another. Epictetus also had a lamp, said the dean, which was sold for a fancy price after his death. It was the lamp he wrote his philosophical dissertations by. You know Epictetus? Epictetus?
Mm-hmm.
An old gentleman, said Stephen coarsely, who said that the soul is very like a bucketful of water. He tells us in his homely way, the dean went on, that he put an iron lamp before a statue of one of the gods and that a thief stole the lamp. What did the philosopher do? He reflected that it was in character of a thief to steal and determined to buy an earthen lamp next day instead of the iron lamp. Next, please.
A smell of molten tallow came up from the dean's candle box and fused itself in Stephen's consciousness with the jingle of the words, bucket and lamp and bucket. The priest's voice, too, had a hard, jingling tone. Stephen's mind halted by instinct, checked by the strange tone and the imagery, and by the priest's face, which seemed like an unlit lamp or a reflector hung in a false focus. What lay behind it or within it? A dull torpor of the soul, or the dullness of the thundercloud, charged with intellection and capable of the gloom of God. Let me read that again. A dull torpor of the soul, or the dullness of the thundercloud, charged with intellection and capable of the gloom of God. I mean a different kind of lamp, sir, said Stephen. Undoubtedly, said the dean. One difficulty, said Stephen, in aesthetic discussion is to know whether words are being used according to the literary tradition or according to the tradition of the marketplace. I remember a sentence of Newman's in which he says of the Blessed Virgin that she was detained in the full company of the saints. The use of the word in the marketplace is quite different. I hope I'm not detaining you. Not in the least, said the dean politely. No, Stephen said, smiling. I mean, yes, I see, said the dean quickly. I quite catch the point. Detain. He thrust forward his underjaw and uttered a dry, short cough. To return to the lamp, he said, the feeding of it is also a nice problem. You must choose the pure oil, and you must be careful when you pour it in, not to overflow it, not to pour in more than the funnel can hold. What funnel? Asked Stephen. the funnel through which you pour the oil into the lamp. That, said Stephen, is that called a funnel? Is it not a tundish? What's a tundish? That, the funnel. Is that called a tundish in Ireland? Asked the dean. I've never heard the word in my life. It's called a tundish in Lower Drumcondra, said Stephen, laughing, where they speak the best English. A tundish, said the dean reflectively. That's a most interesting word. I must look that word up. Upon my word, I must. Next, please.
His courtesy of manner rang a little false, and Stephen looked at the English convert with the same eyes as the elder brother in the parable may have turned on the prodigal. The humble follower in the wake of clamorous conversions. A poor Englishman in Ireland, he seemed to have entered on the stage of Jesuit history when that strange play of intrigue and suffering and envy and struggle and indignity had been all but given through. A latecomer, a tardy spirit. From what had he set out? Perhaps he had been born and bred among serious dissenters, seeing salvation in Jesus only, and abhorring the vain pomps of the establishment. Had he felt the need of an implicit faith amid the welter of sectarianism and the jargon of its turbulent schisms? 6 principal men, peculiar people, seed and snake Baptists, supralapsarian dogmatists. Had he found the true church all of a sudden, in winding to the end like a reel of cotton, some fine-spun line of reasoning upon insufflation or the imposition of hands, or the procession of the Holy Ghost? Or had Lord Christ touched him and bidden him follow, like that disciple who had sat at the receipt of custom, as he sat by the door of some Zincruft chapel, yawning and telling over his church pence? The dean repeated the word yet again. Wouldn't it? Well, now that is interesting. The question you asked me a moment ago seems to be, to me, more interesting. What is that beauty which the artist struggles to express from lumps of earth, said Stephen coldly. The little words seemed to have turned a rapier point of his sensitiveness against this courteous and vigilant foe. He felt with a smart of dejection that the man to whom he was speaking was a countryman of Ben Jonson. He thought, the language in which we are speaking is his before it is mine. How different are the words home, Christ, ale, master, on his lips and on mine. I cannot write or speak these words without unrest of spirit. His language, so familiar and so foreign, will always be for me an acquired speech. I have not made or accepted his words. My voice holds them at bay. My soul frets in the shadow of his language. And to distinguish between the beautiful and the sublime, the dean added, to distinguish between moral beauty and material beauty, and to inquire what kind of beauty is proper to each of the various arts. These are some interesting points we might take up. Next, please.
Stephen, disheartened suddenly by the dean's firm, dry tone, was silent. And through the silence, a distant noise of many boots and confused voices came up the staircase. In pursuing these speculations, said the dean conclusively, there is, however, the danger of perishing of inanition. First, you must take your degree. Set that before you as your first aim. Then, little by little, you will see your way. I mean, in every sense, your way in life and in thinking. It may be uphill pedaling at first. Take Mr. Moonan. He was a long time before he got to the top, but he got there. I may not have his talent, Stephen said quietly, You never know, said the dean brightly. We never can say what is in us. I most certainly should not be despondent. Per aspera ad astra. He left the heart quickly and went towards the landing to oversee the arrival of the first arts class. Leaning against the fireplace, Stephen heard him greet briskly and impartially every student of the class and could almost see the frank smiles of the coarser students. A desolating pity began to fall like dew upon his easily embittered heart for this faithful serving man of the knightly Loyola, for this half-brother of the clergy, more venal than they in speech, more steadfast of soul than they, one whom he would never call his ghostly father. And he thought how this man and his companions had earned the name of worldlings at the hands not of the unworldly, but only, but of the worldly also, for having pleaded during all their history at the bar of God's justice for the souls of the lax and the lukewarm and the prudent. The entry of the professor was signalled by a few rounds of Kentish fire from the heavy boots of those students who sat on the highest tier of the gloomy theatre under the grey cobwebbed windows. The calling of the roll began, and the responses to the names were given out in all tones until the name of Peter Byrne was reached. Here, a deep bass note in response came from the upper tier, followed by coughs of protest along the other benches. The professor paused in his reading and called the next name, Cranley. No answer. Mr. Cranley. A smile flew across Stephen's face as he thought of his friend's studies. Try Leopardstown, said a voice from the bench behind. Lois.
Stephen glanced up quickly, but Moynihan's snoutish face, outlined on the grey light, was impassive. A formula was given out. Amid the rustling of the notebooks, Stephen turned back again and said, "Give me some paper, for God's sake." "Are you as bad as that?" asked Moynihan with a broad grin. He tore a sheet from his scribble and passed it down, whispering, "In case of necessity, any layman or woman can do it." The formula which he wrote obediently on the sheet of paper, the coiling and uncoiling calculations of the professor, the spectre-like symbols of force and velocity, fascinated and jaded Stephen's mind. He had heard some say that the old professor was an atheist Freemason. Ah, the grey, dull day. It seemed a limbo of painless, patient consciousness through which souls of mathematicians might wander, projecting long, slender fabrics from plane to plane of ever rarer and paler twilight, radiating swift eddies to the vast verges of a universe ever vaster, farther, and more impalpable. Next, please.
Ann Meisner, would you please
Okay.
read?
Yeah. So we must distinguish between elliptical and ellipsoidal. Perhaps some of you gentlemen may be familiar with the works of Mr. W.S. Gilbert. In one of his songs, he speaks of the billiard sharp who is condemned to play music on a cloth untrue with a twisted cue and elliptical billiard balls. He means a ball having the form of the ellipsoid of the principal axis, of which I spoke a moment ago. Moynihan leaned down toward Stephen's ear and murmured, "What price ellipsoidal balls? Chase me, ladies. I'm in the cavalry." His fellow students' rude humor ran like a gust through the cloister of Stephen's mind, shaking into gay life limp priestly vestments that hung upon the walls, setting them to sway and caper in a Sabbath of misrule. The forms of the community emerged from the gust-blown vestments. The dean of studies, the portly, florid bursar with his cap of gray hair, the president, the little priest with feathery hair who wrote devout verses, the squat peasant form of the professor of economics, the tall form of the young professor of mental science, discussing on the landing a case of conscience with his class like a giraffe cropping high leafage among a herd of antelopes. The grave, troubled prefect of the sodality, the plump, round-headed professor of Italian with his rogue's eyes. They came ambling and stumbling, tumbling and capering, kilting their gowns for a leapfrog, holding one another back, shaken with deep false laughter, smacking one another behind and laughing at their rude malice, calling to one another by familiar nicknames, protesting with sudden dignity at some rough usage, whispering two and two behind their hands. The professor had gone to the glass case on the side wall, from a shelf of which he took down a set of coils, blew away the dust from many points, and bearing it carefully to the table, held a finger on it while he proceeded with his lecture. He explained that the wires in modern coils were of a compound called platinoid, lately discovered by F.W. Martino. He spoke clearly the initials and surname of the discoverer. Moynihan whispered from behind, "Good old Freshwater Martin." Next.
Ask him, Stephen whispered back with weary humor. If he wants a subject for electrocution, he can have me. Moynihan, seeing the professor bend over the coils, rose in his bench and, clacking noiselessly the fingers of his right hand, began to call with the voice of a slobbering urchin, please, teacher, this boy is after saying a bad word, teacher." Platinoid, the professor said solemnly, is preferred to German silver because it has a lower coefficient of resistance variation by changes of temperature. The platinoid wire is insulated, and the covering of silk that insulates it is wound on the ebonite bobbins just where my finger is. If it were wound single, an extra current would be induced in the coils. The bobbins are saturated with hot paraffin wax. A sharp Ulster voice said from the bench below Stephen, "Are we likely to be asked questions on applied science?" The professor began to juggle gravely with the terms pure science and applied science. A heavy-built student wearing gold spectacles stared with some wonder at the questioner. Moynihan murmured from behind in his natural voice, "Isn't McAllister a devil for his pound of flesh?" Stephen looked down coldly on the oblong skull beneath him, overgrown with tangled twine-colored hair. The voice, the accent, the mind of the questioner offended him, and he allowed the offense to carry him towards willful unkindness, bidding his mind think that the student's father would have done better had he sent his son to Belfast to study and have saved something on the train fare by doing so. The oblong skull beneath did not turn to meet this shaft of thought, and yet the shaft came back to its bowstring, for he saw in a moment the student's pale face. Next, please.
That thought is not mine, he said to himself quickly. It came from the comic Irishman in the bench behind. Patience, can you stay with certitude by whom the soul of your race was bartered and its elect betrayed? By the questioner or by the mocker? Patience. Remember Epictetus. It is probably It is probably in his character to ask such a question at such a moment, in such a tone, and to pronounce the word science as a monosyllable. The droning voice of the professor continued to wind itself slowly round and round the coils it spoke of, doubling, trebling, quadrupling its somnolent energy as the coil multiplied its ohms of resistance. Moynihan's voice called from behind in echo to a distant bell. Closing time, gents. The entrance hall was crowded with loud with talk. On a table near the door were 2 photographs in frames, and between them a long roll of paper bearing an irregular tail of signatures. McCann went briskly to and fro among the students, talking rapidly, answering rebuffs, and leading one after another to the table. In the inner hall, the Dean of Studies stood talking to a young professor, stroking his chin gravely and nodding his head. Next, please.
Stephen, checked by the crowd at the door, halted irresolutely. From under the wide falling leaf of a soft hat, Cranley's dark eyes were watching him. Have you signed? Stephen asked. Cranley closed his long, thin-lipped mouth, communed with himself an instant, and answered, Ego habeo. What is it for? Quod? What is it for? Cranley turned his pale face to Stephen and said bluntly and bitterly, Per pax universalis. Stephen pointed to the Tsar's photograph and said, he has the face of a besotted Christ. The scorn and anger in his voice brought Cranley's eyes back from a calm survey of the walls of the hall. Are you annoyed? He asked. No, answered Stephen. Are you in a bad humor? No. Credo ut sanguinarius mendax estis, said Cranley. Quia facies vostra monstrat, ut vos in damno malo humore estis. Moynihan on his way to the table said in Stephen's ear, McCann is in tiptoe form, ready to shed the last drop, brand new world. No stimulants and votes for the bitches. Stephen smiled at the manner of his confidence, and when Moynihan had passed, turned his head again to meet Cranley's eyes. Perhaps you can call me, he said. You can tell me, he said, why he pours his soul so freely into my ear. Can you? A dull scowl appeared on Cranley's forehead. He stared at the table where Moynihan had bent to write his name on the roll and said flatly, a sugar? Quis est in malo humore, said Stephen. Ego aut vos? Cranley did not take up the taunt. He brooded sourly on his judgment and repeated with the same flat force, a flaming bloody sugar, that's what he is. It was his epitaph for all dead friendships, and Stephen wondered whether it would ever be spoken in the same tone over his memory. The heavy, lumpish phrase sank slowly out of hearing like a stone through a quagmire. Stephen saw it sink, and he had seen many another, feeling its heaviness depress his heart. Cranley's speech, unlike that of Davin, had neither rare phrases of Elizabethan English nor quaintly turned versions of Irish idioms. Its drawl was an echo of the quays of Dublin, given back by a blank, decaying seaport. Its energy, an echo of the sacred eloquence of Dublin, given back flatly by a Wicklow pulpit. The heavy scowl faded from Cranley's face as McCann marched briskly toward them from the other side of the hall. Here you are, said McCann cheerily. Here I am, said Stephen. Next.
Late as usual. Can you not combine the progressive tendency with the respect for punctuality? That question's out of order, said Stephen. Next business. His smiling eyes were fixed on a silver-wrapped tablet of milk chocolate, which peeped out of the propagandist's breast pocket. The little ring of listeners closed round to hear the war of wits. A lean student with olive skin and lank black hair thrust his face between the two, glancing from one to the other at each phrase, and seemed to try to catch each flying phrase in his open, moist mouth. Cranley took a small gray handball from his pocket and began to examine it closely, turning it over and over. Next business, said McCann. Home. He gave a loud cough of laughter, smiled broadly, and tugged twice at the strawberry goatee which hung from his blunt chin. The next business is to sign the testimonial. Will you pay me anything if I sign? Asked Stephen. I thought you were an idealist, said McCann. The gypsy-like student looked about him and addressed the onlookers in an indistinctive bleating voice. By hell, that's a queer notion. I consider the notion to be a mercenary notion. His voice faded into silence. No heed was paid to his words. He turned his olive face, equine in expression, toward Stephen, inviting him to speak again. McCann began to speak with fluent energy of the Tsar's rescript, a stead of general disarmament, arbitration in cases of international disputes, of the signs of the times, of the new humanity and the new gospel of life, which would make it the business of the community to secure as cheaply as possible the greatest possible happiness of the greatest possible number. The gypsy student responded to the close of the period by crying, 3 cheers for universal brotherhood. Go on, Temple, said a stout, ruddy student. I'll stand you a pint after. I'm a believer in universal brotherhood, said Temple, glancing about him out of his dark oval eyes. Marx is only a bloody cod. Cranley gripped his arm tightly to check his tongue, smiling uneasily, and repeated, easy, easy, easy. Temple struggled to free his arm, but continued, his mouth flecked by a thin foam. Socialism was founded by an Irishman, and the first man in Europe who preached the freedom of thought was Collins. 200 years later, he denounced priestcraft, the philosopher of Middlesex. 3 cheers for John Anthony Collins. Next.
A thin voice from the verge of the ring replied, pip, pip. Moynihan murmured beside Stephen's ear, and what about John Anthony's poor little sister? Lottie Collins lost her drawers. Won't you kindly lend her yours? Stephen laughed, and Moynihan, pleased with the result, murmured again, we'll have 5 bob each way on John Anthony Collins. I'm waiting for your answer, said McCann briefly. The affair doesn't interest me in the least, said Stephen wearily. You know that well. Why do you make a scene about it? Good, said McCann, smacking his lips. You are a reactionary then. You think you impress me, Stephen asked, when you flourish your wooden sword. Metaphors, said McCann bluntly. Come to the facts. Stephen blushed and turned aside. McCann stood his ground and said with hostile humour, minor poets, I suppose, are above such trivial questions as the question of universal peace. Cranley raised his head and held the handball between the 2 students by way of a peace offering, saying, Pax super totum sanguinarium globum. Stephen, moving away the bystanders, jerked his shoulder angrily in the direction of the Tsar's image, saying, keep your icon. If we must have a Jesus, let us have a legitimate Jesus. By hell, that's a good one, said the gypsy student to those about him. That's a fine expression. I like that expression immensely. Gulped down the spittle in his throat as if he were gulping down the phrase, and fumbling at the peak of his tweed cap, turned to Stephen saying, excuse me, sir, what do you mean by that expression you uttered just now? Feeling himself jostled by the students near him, he said to them, I'm curious to know now what he meant by that expression. Next, please.
Turning again to Stephen, he turned again to Stephen and said in a whisper, do you believe in Jesus? I believe in man, of course. I don't know if you believe in man. I admire you, sir. I admire the mind of man independent of all religions. Is that your opinion about the mind of Jesus? Go on, Temple, said the stout, ruddy student, returning, as was his wont, to his first idea. That pint is waiting for you. He thinks I'm an imbecile, Temple explained to Stephen, because I'm a believer in the power of mind. Cranley linked his arms into those of Stephen and his admirer and said, Nos ad manum bellum jocabimus, and bolum jocabimus. Stephen, in the act of being led away, caught sight of McCann's flushed, blunt-featured face. My signature is of no account, he said politely. You are right to go your way. Leave me to go mine. Daedalus, said McCann crisply, I believe you're a good fellow, but you've yet to learn the dignity of altruism and the responsibility of the human individual. A voice said, intellectual crankery is better out of this movement than in it. Stephen, recognizing the harsh tone of McAllister's voice, did not turn in the direction of the voice. Cranley pushed solemnly through the throng of students, linking Stephen and Temple like a celebrant attending his ministers on his way to the altar. Temple bent eagerly across Cranley's breast and said, Did you hear McAllister, what he said? That youth is jealous of you. Did you see that? I bet Cranley didn't see that. By hell, I saw that at once. As they crossed the inner hall, the Dean of Studies was in the act of escaping from the student with whom he had been conversing. He stood at the foot of the staircase, a foot on the lowest step, his threadbare soutane gathered around him for the ascent with womanish care, nodding his head often and repeating, no doubt of it, Mr. Haggett, very fine, not a doubt of it. In the middle of the hall, the prefect of the college sodality was speaking earnestly in a soft, querulous voice with a border. As he spoke, he wrinkled his little freckled brow and bit between his phrases a tiny bone pencil. I hope the matric men will all come. First arts men are pretty sure, second arts too. We must make sure of the newcomers. Temple bent again across Cranley as they were passing through the doorway and said in a swift whisper, do you know that he is a married man? He was a married man before they converted him. He has a wife and children somewhere. By hell, I think that's the queerest notion I ever heard, eh? Next, please.
His whisper trailed off into sly, cackling laughter. The moment they were through the doorway, Cranley seized him rudely by the neck and shook him, saying, "You flaming, floundering fool! I'll take my dying Bible there isn't a bigger bloody ape, do you know, than you in the whole flaming bloody world." Temple wiggled his grip, laughing still with sly contempt, while Cranley repeated flatly at every rude shake, "A flaming, flaring, bloody idiot." They crossed the weedy garden together. The president, wrapped in a heavy, loose cloak, was coming towards them along one of the walks, reading his office. At the end of the walk, he halted before turning and raised his eyes. The students saluted, Temple fumbling as before at the peak of his cap. They walked forward in silence. As they neared the alley, Stephen could hear the thuds of the players' hands and the wet smacks of the ball at Davin's voice crying out excitedly at each stroke. The three students halted round the box on which Davin sat to follow the game. Temple, after a few moments, sidled across to Stephen and said, "Excuse me, I wanted to ask you, do you believe that Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a sincere man?" Stephen laughed outright. Cranley, picking up the broken stave of a cask from the grass at his feet, turned swiftly and said sternly, "Temple, I declare to the living God, if you say another word, do you know, to anybody on any subject, I'll kill you, super spot him. He was like you, I fancy, said Stephen, an emotional man. Blast him, curse him, said Cranley broadly. Don't talk to him at all. Sure, you might as well be talking, do you know, to a flaming chamber pot as talking to Temple. Go home, Temple. For God's sake, go home. I don't care a damn about you, Cranley answered Temple, moving out of reach of the uplifted stave and pointing at Stephen. He's the only man I see in this institution that has an individual mind. Next.
Institution, individual, cried Cranley. Go home, blast you, for you're a hopeless, bloody man. I'm an emotional man, said Temple. That's quite rightly expressed, and I'm proud that I'm an emotionalist. He sidled out of the alley, smiling slyly. Cranley watched him with a blank, expressionless face. Look at him, he said. Did you ever see such a go-by-the-wall? His phrase was greeted by a strange laugh from a student who lounged against the wall, his peaked cap down on his eyes. The laugh, pitched in a high key and coming from a so muscular frame, seemed like the whinny of an elephant. The student's body shook all over, and to ease his mirth, he rubbed both his hands delightedly over his groins. Lynch is awake, said Cranley. Lynch, for answer, straightened himself and thrust forward his chest. Lynch puts out his chest, said Stephen, as a criticism of life. Lynch smote himself sonorously on his chest and said, who has anything to say about my girth? Cranley took him out at the word, and the two began to tussle. When their faces had flushed with the struggle, they drew apart, panting. Stephen bent down towards Davin, who, intent on the game, had paid no heed to the talk of the others. And how is my little tame goose, he asked. Did he sign too? Davin nodded and said, and you, Stevie? Stephen shook his head. You're a terrible man, Stevie, said David, taking a short pipe from his mouth. Always alone. Now that you have signed the petition for universal peace, said Stephen, I suppose you will burn that little copybook I saw in your room. As David did not answer, Stephen began to quote, Long pace Fianna, right incline Fianna, Fianna by numbers, salute 1, 2. That's a different question, said David. I'm an Irish nationalist, first and foremost. But that's you all out. You're a born sneerer, Stevie. Next.
When you make the next rebellion with Hurley sticks, said Stephen, and want the indispensable informer, tell me. I can find you a few in this college. I can't understand you, said Davin. One time I hear you talk against English literature, and now you talk against the Irish informers. What was your name and your ideas? Are you Irish at all? Come with me now to the office of arms, and I will show you the tree of my family, said Stephen. Then be one of us, said Davin. Why don't you learn Irish? Why did you drop out of the elite class after the first lesson? You know one reason why, answered Stephen. Davin tossed his head and laughed. Oh, come now, he said. It is on account of that certain young lady. Is it on account of that certain young lady and Father Moran? But that's all in your mind, Stevie. They were only talking and laughing. Stephen paused and laid a friendly hand upon Davin's shoulder. Do you remember, he said, when we knew each other first? The first morning we met, you asked me to show you the way to the matriculation class, putting a very strong stress on the first syllable. Do you remember? Then you used to address the Jesuits as father. You remember? I asked myself about you. Is he as innocent as his speech? I'm a simple person, said Davin. You know that. When you told me that night in Harcourt Street those things about your private life, honest to God, Stevie, I was not able to eat my dinner. I was quite bad. I was awake a long time that night. Why did you tell me those things? Thanks, said Stephen. You mean I am a monster? No, said Davin, but I wish you had not told me. The tide began to surge beneath the calm surface of Stephen's friendliness. This race and this country and this life produced me, he said. I shall express myself as I am. Try to be one of us, repeated Davin. In your heart, you are an Irishman, but your pride is too powerful. My ancestors threw out their language and took another, Stephen said. They allowed a handful of foreigners to subject them. Do you fancy I'm going to pay in my own life in person debts they made? What for? For our freedom, said Davin. No honorable and sincere man, said Stephen, has given up to you his life and his youth and his affections from the days of the Tone to those of Parnell, days of Tone to those of Parnell. But you sold him to the enemy, or failed him in need, or reviled him and left him for another. And you invite me to be one of you? I'll see you down first. They died for their ideals, Stevie, said Davin. Our day will come yet, believe me. Next, please.
Stephen followed his own thought, was silent for an instant. The soul is born, he said vaguely, first in those moments I told you of. It has a slow and dark birth, more mysterious than the birth of the body. When the soul of a man is born in this country, there are nets flung at it to hold it back from flight. You talk to me of nationality, language, religion. I shall try to fly by those nets. Davin knocked the ashes from his pipe. Too deep for me, Stevie, he said. But a man's country comes first. Ireland first, Stevie. You can be a poet or a mystic after. Do you know what Ireland is? Asked Stephen with cold violence. Ireland is this old sow that eats her farrow. Davin rose from his box and went towards the players, shaking his head sadly. But in a moment his sadness left him, and he was hotly disputing with Cranley and the two players who had finished their game. A match of 4 was arranged. Cranley insisting, however, that his ball should be first. He let it rebound twice or thrice to his hand and struck it strongly and swiftly towards the base of the alley, exclaiming in answer to its thud, "Your soul?" Stephen stood with Lynch till the score began to rise, and then he plucked him by the sleeve to come away. Lynch obeyed, saying, "Let us eat go, as Cranley has said." Stephen smiled at this side thrust. Next, please.
They passed back through the garden and out through the hall, where the doddering porter was pinning up a notice in the frame. At the foot of the steps they halted, and Stephen took a packet of cigarettes from his pocket and offered it to his companion. "I know you are poor," he said. "Damn your yellow insolence," answered Lynch. The second proof of Lynch's culture made Stephen smile again. "It was a great day for European culture," he said, "when you made up your mind to swear in yellow." They lit their cigarettes and turned to the right. After a pause, Stephen began. "Aristotle has not defined pity and terror. I have. I say," Lynch halted and said bluntly, "Stop, I won't listen. I am sick. I was out last night on a yellow drunk with Horan and Goggins." Stephen went on. "Pity is the feeling which arrests the mind in the presence of whatsoever is grave and constant in human sufferings, and unites it with the human sufferer. Terror is the feeling which arrests the mind in the presence of whatsoever is grave and constant in human sufferings, and unites it with the secret cause." "Repeat," said Lynch. Stephen repeated the definition slowly. "A girl got into a hansom a few days ago," he went on, in London. She was on her way to meet her mother, whom she had not seen for many years. At the corner of a street, the shaft of a lorry shivered the window of the hansom in the shape of a star. A long, fine needle of the shivered glass pierced her heart. She died on the instant. The reporter called it a tragic death. It is not. It is remote from terror and pity, according to the terms of my definitions. The tragic emotion, in fact, is a face looking two ways, toward terror and toward pity, both of which are phases of it. You see, I use the word arrest. I mean that the tragic emotion is static, or rather the dramatic emotion is. The feelings excited by improper art are kinetic, desire or loathing. Desire urges us to possess, to go to something. Loathing urges us to abandon, to go from something. These are kinetic emotions. The arts which excite them, pornographical or didactic, are therefore improper arts. The aesthetic emotion, I use the general term, is therefore static. The mind is arrested and raised above desire and loathing. Next, please. I have to leave, by the way. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. We're going to stop here anyway. Yeah. Okay. I don't know what to say. This is a kind of overwhelming chapter in its own way.
Yes.
It has a lot more subtlety in some ways in it, and it's almost, I'm glad we read as much as we did, but there's a lot in here, and there's a lot of things that at least I have to think about
Yeah, same here.
quite a bit. And so I would, it's very hard to carry this over from one session to another, but I think I'm going to do a bunch of thinking and rereading on this chapter between now and the next time. And maybe if others are interested, we'll have some discussion about what we've read before we move on. I just don't know. I'm a bit overwhelmed at the moment.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion, Duncan.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So let's do that. Let's just wrap it up for the day, unless someone has an immediate question or point they'd like to make. But I really need to step back from this and
Mhm.
Yeah.
And
I'm
chew
glad-
on it.
Yeah. I'm glad
yeah,
you said
Chew on
that.
it.
I have to read it over.
yeah, there's a
Yes.
lot of stuff here. Well, I think, it's kind of they're like chunks in here. And it's a matter of figuring out where a good coherent chunk is and analyzing that and then looking for the next chunk. That's how it feels to me anyway.
Yeah, I kept losing my train of thought.
Yeah.
Uh,
I appreciate you saying that, Duncan, because I was feeling kind of lost and thinking, am I the only one?
No.
No.
No, this is
Join the
very,
club.
yeah, this is very rich and very, very subtle.
Mm.
There's a lot
compared-
with a lot of translations. I mean,
Well,
a lot
there's
of
a lot of
Latin terms and a lot of poetry. I mean, yeah, we just read,
Yeah,
and they
yeah.
weren't translated in the text.
right. And, just for a very simple thing, this thing where Cranley
Yeah.
and Stephen are able to converse in Latin,
Mhm.
and I think far beyond any of the other students.
Yeah.
It seems to me. It's almost like their Latin is a private language.
Yes.
So anyway, lots to think about. Really good reading.
Thank you.
And we'll just see how we want to handle it when we gather together next time.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Duncan.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Duncan.
Thank you. Always. Thank everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you very
everybody.
much,
Bye.
everyone. And
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Press the red button. Bye-bye.